Today I'm talking with award-winning translator Morgan Giles. She and I actually read the same first Japanese novel back in 2003, and we were both inspired to do so by the same blog post. So listen in for that and lots of great insight about translation. Morgan Giles is a Japanese translator based in London. She's translated a number of different writers, including Kanehara Hitomi, Furukawa Hideo, and the National Book Award-winning Tokyo Ueno Station by Yu Midi. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So, Morgan Giles, how did you learn Japanese?
Well, as you can tell, I'm not from London originally. I'm from Kentucky, and where I grew up, my hometown is Richmond, Kentucky. We're not too far from Georgetown, which is the site of the first Toyota factory built in North America. So because of that, there's a lot of Japanese companies around. There's a lot of Japanese people around, and a lot of Japanese cultural influence, I guess you could say.
Sure.
So when I was 12, I was picked as part of a sister cities exchange. And exchange is like a very generous term, I think, for what it was, because, it's a bunch of 12-year-olds. So it was a 2-year thing. So
Wow.
The first year you would go to Yamanashi Prefecture for 1 week. And then the next year, your host brother or host sister would come to Kentucky for 1 week. So it was both short and long term. So because of that, I decided to start learning Japanese just enough that I would be able to communicate a little bit with my host family. And I wasn't really able to say much more than yes and no, and understand some really basic words when I went. But I just really loved learning a language. It did something for my brain that nothing else had done yet. I've always been really interested in language, and before I started learning Japanese, I was always really obsessed with like finding out etymologies of English words and things like that. So it tickled some part of my brain that
That's great.
It's really fundamental to me. Yeah.
That would have been before you started studying other foreign languages in junior high or elementary school, something like that? Or were you exposed to other languages at school?
No, in my school, you didn't start studying another language until high school.
Okay.
I went to a really, really small school, and so there just wasn't that much scope to learn another language.
So this was the first one then?
So, yeah.
Great.
That was the first love. Yeah.
Nice. And is there a reason for Yamanashi? I know Toyota is based outside Nagoya, I believe.
The reason is that this is quite mysterious to me even now, but the reason is that before World War II, there was a man from my area who was living in the Minami Alps region of Yamanashi Prefecture, called Paul Rush.
Huh. And
do you know Paul Rush?
No.
No. Okay.
It just sounds like it's going to be a great story.
There's no reason to, I think, unless you are from my particular hometown or from this particular region of Yamanashi. But so he was living there and he loved it, and he had to leave because of the war. But as soon as he could get back to Japan, he shipped over a ton of tractors and farm equipment and other necessary farming materials and implements. And he was celebrated in the area for this. They have a county fair there every summer, like a really American style county fair that I believe, I never witnessed this, but I believe it involves an element of kind of a traditional Japanese matsuri, but with people driving the tractors down the road. So it's this really wonderful mix of American rural culture and Japanese rural culture that
That
yeah,
sounds
that's
great.
that's
Yeah.
the link. This one random guy was living there, and he brought over some John Deere tractors, and now now, now here I am.
That's great. No, that's really cool. And did you feel like you were able to communicate a little bit with the language that you had learned?
The thing is that while I was in Yamanashi, I wound up getting very sick. I
Oh,
was
okay.
very, very sick actually, and it was the last day of my time in Japan that I was at Tokyo Disney World actually, because they'd taken us back to Tokyo the day before we were going to fly out so that we could, stay in a hotel and whatever. And I collapsed at Tokyo Disneyland and had to be taken to the hospital, where it turned out that I had pneumonia and severe dehydration because I had not been able to ask for water
Oh, wow.
from my host
Oh, no.
family.
Oh, no.
So if you want to talk about formative experiences that really make you see the value of being able to communicate with other people, that's that's
Sure.
kind of my big one, right?
That's funny. I had pneumonia on jet, and it was a rough time too. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not great. I wouldn't recommend it to anyone. It's
No.
yeah.
Yeah, and I mean it's critical to. I mean, I think so often when you go over to Japan, sometimes you can be hesitant to try and burden anyone with any kind of request or inconveniencing anyone in any way. But I do think with your health, you really need to be like, hey, something's going on here. But man,
Absolutely.
oh, what a nightmare. So I imagine you took university courses then later, or between the Yamanashi experience and then actually starting study, were there any other Japanese experiences?
Yeah, so the school that I went to, it's a all-in-one school. So from preschool to high school, all in one building. Like I said, it's really small, but it's based on the campus of Eastern Kentucky University. Um, and because my mother worked there, she got a certain number of credit hours free every semester. And the principal of my school um, kindly allowed me to take Japanese classes at the college while I was in high school. Um, so that was amazing, and my teacher then was understandably slightly hesitant to have like a 15-year-old in her college
Mm,
class, but it was the most really incredible experience to be able to do that in retrospect. At the time, of course, it felt perfectly normal to
yeah,
me that this was happening. But as an adult, I know that is not not the kind of um, average experience that a young person has when they're really interested in something. So I was really lucky to be in an environment and have um, the background or the resources to be able to focus so intently on what I wanted to study from such a young age.
great. And what was that approach like? Do you remember strategies that the teacher used and things that were effective when you were taking those classes?
It feels like a million years ago.
Sure.
I remember that we used the Genki textbooks,
Okay.
and there was quite a lot of focus in her classes on getting students to have real conversations. So she was always encouraging people to learn new vocabulary, to be able to talk about the things that they wanted to talk about outside of what was being taught in the textbook. And she was a big promoter of independent study. So, you know, finding whatever you're interested in and using that as a means of getting into the language.
Sure.
So with me, when I finished, I think it only went up to 202 level. So when I finished Japanese 202, she was like, well, if you want to keep studying, you really love reading, why don't you pick a Japanese book and we can meet one day a week and read through it together. And that's kind of in a roundabout way how I first started translating, because my notes about the grammar and the vocabulary that I was learning quickly turned into making a kind of a rough translation of what was happening on the Japanese page. And as I went on, that was becoming more and more fun to me.
Yeah.
And it was a way that helped me kind of consolidate what I was learning more than just making vocabulary lists, because I was really having to process it in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. So yeah, I still really admire her dedication to kind of letting students guide themselves. So freedom within a structure, I guess, is the key thing that I kind of take away from my teacher's approach.
Do you remember what that book was?
That book was Keritai Senaka by Watae Risa.
Yeah, I mean, that was my first book, actually. That's funny. And
really?
I had a similar situation where I was at Waseda, and it had just come out, and all the issues of Bungei Shunju were sold out, and you couldn't get it until it came out in the tankobon. And then, so I got it, and it's funny, I had missed the deadline to apply for independent study because I was just so aloof at the time that I didn't realize that you had to apply to do independent study.
Right. It seems like a contradiction, right?
Yeah. And, but I was also there on a fellowship, and I had kind of promised to do independent study. And so I was like, oh no, I have made a terrible mistake. But luckily my professor, Richie Sakakibara at Waseda was really...
I know Sakakibara sensei.
Oh, you do? Oh, she's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, she was really generous with her time. And she said, yeah, sure, why not? Let's do an independent study. Because I'd taken her lit class in the first semester. And so we met and we read, like, I was reading something like 2 pages a day, but we met once a week and we'd go over it. But, it's funny. I was thinking about that book the other day, and I really should have reviewed it before this interview, but I don't remember it as vividly as the Kanehara Hitomi book that also won the prize that year. But maybe because I reviewed that one more recently in the English translation. But it was an interesting book. I do remember Sakakibara sensei being like, "Oh, this Watae Risa writer. This is an interesting novel." So.
Yeah, I wish I remembered it better. I mean, I did eventually wind up doing kind of a full translation of it. But obviously mine hasn't been published. Someone else published an English translation, which I haven't read, because it just feels a little too personal somehow.
Sure.
I don't really want to revisit it, I guess. But yeah, I mean, I guess the Kanehara Hitomi book is slightly more vivid because it is such a vivid book, right?
Yeah, for sure.
There's a lot of really attention grabbing stuff going on there, whereas maybe Keritai Senaka is a slightly quieter book. But what attracted me to it at the time is that and like you, I read it the year that it won the Octagawa Prize. Is that I was only like 2 years younger than Watae Risa, and I was kind of like, wow, someone not that much older than me has just won like a major literary prize. That really made a big impression on me. Kids these days don't know how good they have it, because back in those days, if you wanted to buy a Japanese book in America, you'd have to like send a letter with a postal order to like Mitsuwa Market in Chicago, and they'd mail the book back to you. But it really was a different time.
For sure. Yeah, man. Yeah. That makes me think about Akutagawa prize-winning books, do you think that's an interesting way for kind of, intermediate students to get into reading? I mean, they're not that long, but I do think, they're all junbungaku, maybe a little bit more complex sometimes than some of the lighter stuff. What do you think about that in terms of using those as a way to get into a reading practice?
I think it can be good because one of the key things I think is using it as a way to engage with the broader culture. So any book that wins a big prize, there will be lots of people talking about it, right? And so you can really create an immersive experience for yourself as a learner. I think, especially now that the internet is so much more developed than it was back in
Mm-hmm.
my day. You can read blogs about the book as well, which will help guide your reading a little bit. Um, all in all, I think I don't know if this is going to be controversial, but I think actually reading a Junbungaku book as an intermediate learner might in some ways be a little more accessible because in general there's not so much specialist vocabulary.
Okay.
Like if you're reading a murder mystery or something, or like something set in a hospital or something, there's going to be a lot of words that you don't know. But if you're reading, a quiet story about a girl who lives with her grandma or something, it's going to be a different experience. But I mean, ultimately, I still really feel like it comes down to whatever grabs you. If you surround yourself with things that you're interested in, you will want to read, you'll want to listen or watch, and that will mean that you're learning. Um, I do think that reading is something that any learner should consciously incorporate into their learning. It's because it is kind of the biggest hurdle for a
Sure.
native English speaker, right? So
Yeah.
it is something that you have to consciously do, even if you're not a great reader in English. But whatever you're reading, whatever it is, whether it's light novels or even just like I don't know, promotional materials for your favorite boy band or whatever. I think
Yeah.
that's great. Like whatever your passion is, there's something for it, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to pay attention to that. Like, do you have a sense that you're being like propelled through this piece of reading, this work, right? Like
Right.
that's
Like, do you
ideally,
want
yeah,
to know what happens next or
exactly.
what the
Or is
next
it
sentence
a
is?
slog? I mean, the slog can be good, the slog can be bad, but I mean, you're gonna have a slog at some point somewhere.
It's
But
all going to be a slog to
yeah,
begin with, right?
yeah, yeah, for sure. And I do think like the first couple pages of a novel, especially in a different language, can be really disorienting, and then you can kind of settle in. I do feel like after that maybe 5-10 page mark, and maybe the writer also starts to settle into their world a little bit.
Totally. And with a language like Japanese that lends itself to withholding information,
Hmm.
um, you're gonna you're gonna experience that kind of disorientation a lot more when you're reading like a so-called high literature book, like a Junbunagaku book. But but I think that sense of unease, that sense of discomfort, is actually where a lot of learning comes from because
Hmm.
you are constantly asking yourself what's going on here, you know.
Yep. Oh, and one other thing before I forget is that if you can manage to get an actual magazine copy of it, they also do they still have the hyoka or whatever they call it, the evaluation by the judges.
Mm, yes,
That was always really interesting to read. Obviously, the Akutagawa is infamously stodgy and kind of harsh, and usually like C plus it passes. Like that's
exactly.
and then but I remember tracking down the ones for Murakami when he won the I can't remember the name of the prize he won, but not the Akutagawa, but and it's all like very harsh and negative, and but it's always written by interesting people, interesting to see what they say about it, and gives you another type of language to look at, the language of criticism, I think. So
Right. I usually enjoy reading the judges' thoughts about the winning book more than I enjoy reading the, like I guess that's kind of something that I love about Japanese books is that there's almost always either an essay by somebody else after it or an essay by the author afterwards. But I love the ones where there's an essay by somebody else after it because it fills that need that I feel after I've read something to talk about it with someone, and then you flip the page and right there's someone incredibly smart
yeah,
who is just offering you their opinions on it, and it gives me a feeling like, oh, okay, I can bounce these opinions off my own and see how I really feel about it. I love that.
yeah. So you're reading kind of even before you finish high school, you're reading Japanese novels, which is amazing. And then in university, are you able to then, I guess, or yeah, what were your classes like there, and how did you continue your reading practice?
So I went to Indiana University, Bloomington, because it had such a great Asian languages and studies department. And but in fact, it has a really incredible languages program in general, not just for Asian languages, but for some quite rare ones in America, like Tibetan and things like that. And there, it was far more structured, and seemed to involve a lot of just memorizing lists of kanji, which I was never great at all. So I was constantly having to try to find my own strategies to help me do things, and so I was constructing sentences and trying to find these words in the wild so that I could have some kind of context to help me remember them. I I don't know. There was a fairly large Japanese student population there, and so that was probably mainly how I was studying then. I was hanging out with other Japanese students, and I wasn't only studying Japanese, so I majored in Japanese and minored in linguistics. So actually, one of my good friends when I was at college was Japanese, and she was studying linguistics too. And so we would study together, which was, again, really helpful because it was forcing me to learn new vocabulary and talk about something other than, what I did that day or whatever I was expected to talk about in Japanese class.
Yeah.
It was I was learning two things at once, right? Which I think does something in your brain. I'm not a neuroscientist, obviously, but it is incredibly helpful for your learning if you are able to kind of learn something else in your second language,
Yeah, the language at that point becomes more than just kind of equating nouns in two different languages, right? Like you're actually like starting to think in a language. Yeah,
it becomes much more part of your life if you if you're not separating it from everything else. If it is an integral part of whatever else you're doing, then of course your brain devotes more kind of importance to it, right? So my first couple of years in Bloomington, the learning was quite structured, but then after a certain level, again, it went to a slightly more independent study. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear my husband sneezing in the background.
No worries.
The joys of recording. And what really what I remember the most actually was from my last year at IU when I joined a translation workshop at the invitation of my professor. And that was really eye-opening because it was kind of she would assign us texts, right?
Hmm.
A variety of texts, so not just literary, but and then we also had to complete a final project of our own choosing, and that's where I really started to think about translation, what it is, how it functions, because it was so interesting to go around a room and hear 15 different people's different version of the same text. All of us would go in thinking that we had found like the one true English version of this, and then we would hear other people's versions and we would go, oh wow, okay, I never would have thought about that, but that's also right. Wow, okay. It was kind of really mind expanding to have that experience, and that was definitely the first time that I really thought, maybe translation is something that I want to do, but I didn't know how you go about doing that, right?
Hmm.
So I asked my professor at the end of the semester. I was like, I really enjoy translation, and I think maybe that's something that I want to try to do. And she was like, okay. She was like, well, you're about to graduate. What are you thinking about doing next? And I was like, I don't know. And she was like, don't do a master's.
Really? Oh, wow. Okay.
And I said, okay, why not? And she said, if you really want to do translation, you don't need to do a master's. You don't need to do a PhD, and you don't need to go into academia unless you want to do those things. Otherwise, it's just a colossal waste of your time. And I said, okay, because that was kind of dimly what I thought I should probably be doing next with my life. And she said, if you really want to translate books, you need to go out and live. You need to have as many experiences as you can. You need to work in all kinds of jobs, meet all kinds of people, read all kinds of books, just soak it in. You're 20, like you need to grow a bit before you can
Sure.
before you can really have the emotional depth to do this. And she said, you will gain a certain range of emotional depth from doing a master's, but it will not necessarily be as good for you as it would be for you to just go out and work for a living. And I think I'm really thankful for that advice still,
Sure.
because it reframed everything after that, because I would be like having a terrible day at my office job and I would think, well, at least this is going to be a good experience for later.
And so it sounds like, did you study abroad when you were in university? And then it sounded like you just kind of were working after that and maybe still reading and translating.
Yeah, no, I didn't study abroad. I wish that I had. I really wanted to, but for personal reasons, I also really wanted to finish college in 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
It's very difficult now, like so many years on, to explain even to myself why I really wanted to do that, but I did. But yeah, right after I graduated college, I moved to England for work, and the work I was doing had absolutely nothing to do with Japanese or translation. I started working in social media, which is an interesting field to work in, and is one that I still work in as well. But one of the benefits of that was that I had a lot of downtime and I was always in front of a computer.
Mm-hmm.
So I started, like, just to kind of, keep my mind from dying.
Yeah, sure.
I started playing around with texts on Alzora Bunko, and just working on little translations of stuff that I found interesting. And eventually I decided to start a blog where I would put these up um, which felt really scary at the time because I was like, I'm nothing, I'm nobody. How do I? It just felt so embarrassing because I was like, oh no, what if I've made mistakes? But then on some level, I also kind of thought, well, if I'm not going to share these with anybody, then what am I doing them for? And if I have made mistakes and somebody points them out, then that's great. That's actually exactly what I need. Um, and through that, I started to meet a few translators and read other people's blogs, such as yours.
Oh, thank you. Yeah.
There
And I think
was
we have a couple other, friends in common as well who have,
yeah,
yeah.
who were all blogging around that time.
This would have been like when, like 2000, it would have been at least after 2008 to 2010, 11, something around that time. I want to
Yeah,
say.
I graduated in 2009, so
Okay.
yeah, definitely somewhere in there. And like I know that blogging is kind of dead as a as a form now, but like
Sadly.
at the time, right, there was like a really vibrant kind of community of people that were blogging about learning Japanese or translating or whatever.
Yeah. Japanese
And it was a
culture.
really,
Yeah.
really good kind of welcoming um, community is maybe too strong a word, but like, you know,
Hmm.
it was all a good group of people who were actually really pretty generous if you reached out to them.
For sure.
Um, yeah. So I found some people that were encouraging, and that kind of drove me to keep working at these little translations of things that were in the public domain when I was stealing time from my boss.
Yeah, I mean, just to mention one of these friends, Matt Treva, that's how I found out about Keritai Senaka. It was from his blog. I had,
Same,
no
same.
idea. I remember he very vividly him writing about it, and that's, where I learned that it had sold out. And strangely enough, one night when I was walking home to the apartment where I was staying the summer after I finished at Waseda, not far from campus, it's like walking home, probably drunkenly from the Oedo-sen, I think. I had probably come back from Shinjuku. It was a long walk, but I was really proud that I had like found this path to this other subway line that wasn't like immediately accessible. And like I was walking home, and then underneath this like street light was a stack of magazines, and one happened to be the issue with those two novels in
Oh
them.
wow.
It was very weird. It felt like a strange moment, but that's just a total aside. But I do think Alzora is a fantastic way to kind of get translatable material that's not going to get your blog taken down. And yeah, I don't know. Blogs, I guess, are dead to a certain extent. I don't know. It's. I wonder what happened. I guess people just got tired, or they just kind of moved to Twitter. But I do think that there's something
I have a
about.
lot of opinions about
Oh yeah,
this working in social
social media.
media.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the newsletter is interesting, but I think no matter what, you know, happens, I think the important thing to note is you have to kind of go out there and bump into people a little bit. You have to get involved. You have to comment. You have to try and engage with people. And I think that really helps. Like, just even in terms of getting readers, that's kind of just, that's how I developed the readership, I think, was just kind of putting it out there, which is strange at
Yeah.
first. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was a very primitive form of the kind of social media networking that people do now, but it was in many ways like a lot more personal.
Hmm.
But I mean, I do think that like those same techniques, like you say, are really still valid, still really good ways of building a readership, but more importantly than building readership, like building a network,
Yeah.
right? Um, building a sense that you're not just on your own. It's very easy when you're learning a language or when you're doing something like translating to feel quite alone because you
Hmm.
do spend a lot of hours on
Yeah.
your own, right? But if you manage to build a network of like-minded people, you're never really alone because you always know that you can turn to someone and ask for their advice, or even give them advice when they need it, and that makes it, I think, really rewarding thing. What is the world without people? It's
Yeah, for
nothing,
sure.
right?
Yeah. I mean, I think we've learned that during the last year, right? Like,
Yeah.
if we learned
Oh
anything.
my God,
But
yeah.
so you're practicing your translation, you're publishing online a little bit on your own site, some public domain stuff. So how do you get from that point to where you are now, which is you're publishing these um, authors who aren't on Aozora Bunko, who are who are living authors who are um, part of the conversation, I think, of Japanese literature.
Yeah, well, I just started buying a lot of Japanese books and reading them and developing my tastes a little more,
Hmm.
Um, and I was reading widely in translation as well,
Hmm.
So at some point around 2011, 2012, I met a literary translator. I met someone who translated books for a living, Ruth Martin, who translates from German into English. And she was a friend of a friend. And she was like, "Oh, you translate? That's really interesting. That's cool. Is that something that you've ever thought about trying to do for money?" And I was like, "Well, yes, all the time, but I don't know how you do that." And she very, very generously took me to the pub and gave me a really concrete set of steps to take to try to get my foot in the door.
Mm.
And you know, I say that like it's some kind of Konami code, but it's very much not, because there is no easy
Sure.
path, right? But she was like, get business cards made. You need to go to the London Book Fair and meet publishers, and I'll help introduce you to the people that I know. And you should join this group that's for emerging translators. Um, those were the main things that she told me, and she also told me to apply to the British Centre for Literary Translation summer school that year, which I did and was accepted. And that really is where it began for me professionally. So the British Centre for Literary Translation summer school, they don't always offer Japanese, but when they do, it's usually financially supported by the Nippon Foundation. Um, and that's not just an act of generosity on their part, because they genuinely invest a decent amount of money in trying to build new cohorts of Japanese translators, and they put in a lot of effort to make that happen. And one of the ways that they decided to do that was to partially fund the publication of a anthology of short stories called The Book of Tokyo that was put out by Kama Press. And many of those of us that were at the summer school were invited to translate a story for that anthology. So that's how I got my first publication. It was very much a matter of being in the right place in the right time, right? But I don't know where I'm going with this.
No, that's great. Yeah, I mean, I think a little bit of luck is going to be involved with literary work, whether it's translation or even just publishing your own fiction and nonfiction. That's one thing I learned in grad school, is that the winners are the people who just don't stop. The ones who are going to get 5 email rejections and then send out 10 more short story submissions to other literary journals, and then later that day send out queries to 5 different agents until they're represented, until they it's a gradual process, but one that looks exhausting if you try and do it all at one time, but if you take it
Mm.
step by step, it maybe not quite as bad. And I think there's definitely some luck involved, obviously, but you can reduce that, I think, just by being consistent, I think.
You can reduce that by putting yourself out there as much as possible.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing about translation, the thing that I would say to anyone listening to this that maybe wants to think about being a translator is that the translators community is really, really welcoming to people that aspire to be a translator. And most people will take their own time to give you advice, contacts, and help,
Mm,
um, which is strange given the general financial situation of translators.
mm,
But on some level, I think most literary translators are not interested in gatekeeping. It's most literary translators seem to feel like there's a higher good in having as many new people in the profession as we can. But putting yourself out there and being open to asking others for help is, for me, I think the key to anything happening in life. Everything good that I've had in my life has come from those two things.
great. Yeah, and I know that you did eventually have a chance to go study in Japan on a MEXT scholarship. When was that, after this translation workshop? And then what role did that play in your development as a translator?
So I went to Japan on the MEXT scholarship in 2017, which was after I had already gotten the contract to translate Tokyo Ueno Station.
Okay.
I I mean, quite simply, I applied for the scholarship because I wanted to see if I could get it.
Hmm.
And I wanted to live in Japan, which was something that I hadn't done. I had visited for extended periods, but that's not at all the same as living there. And also, on some level, I felt like a little bit of a fraud because every time people would go, "Oh, you translate Japanese? That's really cool. How long did you live there?"
Mm.
um, I I would just have the same feelings of insecurity every time, and on some level, I kind of suspected that they were right. Yeah. That's the worst thing, right? So yeah, so I applied, found out that I was going to have an interview for it the same day that the result for the Brexit referendum came back.
Oh, wow.
That was insanely depressing because, well, obviously the result was insanely depressing, but I was unable to even be excited about this potentially really exciting thing happening, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, I applied through the embassy route, obviously, because I wasn't like in education at the time. But I was really coming up close to the age deadline,
Which
right?
is, I think, 35. Is that what, 34? I can't remember. I looked the other day, and somebody told me.
Yeah, something along those lines. I guess I was just about to turn 30, and I kind of thought, well, if I don't do this now, I will never do this, you know.
Hmm.
Um, I have no children. Like I have work that I can do from anywhere in the world, and I have a partner that is really supportive and really wants this for me. So go for it. Um, and to my surprise, I got the scholarship. Then comes applying directly to the universities, right?
Okay.
And if you don't find, I don't know what happens if you don't find a university that will take you.
Yeah, that's an
I
interesting question.
Right. I applied to three. I applied to Keio, Todai, and Waseda. It was a straight rejection from Keio and Todai. And Waseda were like, "Yeah, cool, come hang out with us,"
Nice.
uh, which is great. And I really enjoyed the environment at Waseda. I was very lucky because I can't say that my process of researching an advisor was very thorough or informed. I was lucky to have been accepted by an advisor who wasn't interested in forcing me to act like I was a regular student on the contemporary Japanese literature course. He was like, "You're a translator. That's great. You're not here because you want to be an academic. So do everything through that lens. Do obviously go to your classes and stuff, but but don't feel the pressure to act like the other students, because you're not like the other students. I mean, I was in fact, like a decade older than all of the other students. So in so many ways, I was not like them."
And so you were there for, is it a year, and your course load, what does your course load, like from a big picture view, look like?
I was there for 2 years.
Oh, 2 years, okay.
So I should say that with the MEXT scholarship, you can opt to take the entrance exams for your university and become a proper, like, actual student, and they will keep paying your tuition and your living costs. But I opted not to do that. So 2 years only. It was a real mix of classes. The constants were like war and literature, or these kind of seminars where it would be focused on like Showa literature, or my worst one, Meiji literature. That was an unending nightmare. I was like, is this even the same language that I've been learning? I don't know.
Oh man.
Like I studied Heian literature for my undergraduate, and I found that so much more understandable than Meiji literature.
Are you in other classes with other Japanese students and Japanese professors being conducted in Japanese?
All being conducted in Japanese. Yeah, I would say about half of my classmates were Chinese, half were Japanese, and there was me. There was always usually one other MEXT student from Germany or France as well. And actually what I kind of really, I loved that atmosphere, because usually Japanese was the only language that we all had in common. So there was never a question of like switching to English. It was always all Japanese all the time. Which was a struggle at first, because my reading skills were so much stronger than my speaking and listening skills. It's like I'd only been working one muscle for like a decade, right? Yeah. And then all of a sudden I'm asked to like help carry a couch. It's just like collapse. But you pick things up really quickly when you're forced to, right? I remember in the first month that I was there, I don't remember exactly what had happened. Anyway, I had been called on in class, and I knew the answer to what the professor was asking, but I only knew it in English, and I didn't know how to explain in Japanese. And I left the class feeling awful. I was standing in the subway station and I was crying, waiting for the train. And this girl walked up to me and she said, Are you an exchange student?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Oh, I understand. It's going to be okay." She was like, "In a month's time, this won't happen to you anymore." And she was right. In a month's time, I had gotten good enough at listening that I could really start picking up on the new vocabulary that I really needed for my studies, and to be able to interact more fully in class. And things just really, really opened up from that point. I'm not gonna lie, it was tough to begin with, but you've been there, you know how it is.
Yeah, you have to develop a really thick skin for making mistakes, feeling bad like that, right? Like you just have to, it's hard to realize it's temporary, right?
Right. Like I think I'm really grateful to her for saying that, because when you are so embarrassed and so uh, hurt and upset, it's really difficult to tell yourself that this is going to end, right?
Yeah.
But it does end at some point, you know. I mean, it in some ways it never ends, right? In some ways
Sure.
we're always learning. There's like, but there's times when I don't know words and I get embarrassed speaking English, which is also something that I try to remind myself of all the time.
Yep. Yeah. No, man, that sounds like such a great experience, though. What's your sense of? I mean, I'm curious to know a little bit about the application process. Is it standard where you're kind of just like writing essays, recommendations, submitting transcripts, things like that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So submit a written application with transcripts and recommendations. That was obviously a little challenging for me, being like 10 years out of college at that
Yep.
point. But my old professors were really happy to do that, and my boss at the time also wrote a recommendation for me, which I thought was really generous of her since it meant that I was going to quit my job. But so yeah, so that's what you initially submit, and then if you get invited for an interview, you will first have to take an English ability test and a Japanese ability test. Um, and then you go in, it's like a full day
Mm.
thing, right? So for me, the morning was taking these tests, and I walked out of them for lunch break feeling like, well, I didn't know I was so bad at English and Japanese.
Mm.
Maybe I should just go home now. And then I went back in after lunch for the interview part, and it was a panel, I think, of three people, one from the embassy, and one or maybe two from Japanese studies departments at nearby universities. And part of the application process, you have to describe what kind of research project you're proposing to work on, with some tacit understanding that the focus of your research will inevitably change once you actually get to Japan and meet your advisor, because your advisor's interests will always kind of shape whatever you're doing in some way.
Mm.
But so I applied with the concept of researching Japanese women in translation and understanding the domestic and international forces that impact whether a woman writer is translated. Did I end
Mm.
up doing this in any way? No, I did not. I absolutely did not end up doing that in any way. But yeah, so you go in for the interview and you talk about who you are and what you've been studying or what you've been doing with your life, why you want to do this, and why you're interested in this research, and why you need to go to Japan for it. Because the thing is, a lot of people that get the MEXT scholarship don't have any real background with Japanese. So you shouldn't think, oh, my Japanese isn't good enough, I can't apply for this.
Got it.
If you've got
Yeah.
a valid reason for why you need to be doing research in Japan, absolutely apply.
And if you have a topic in mind, how fully formed does it have to be, or is if you have just a kind of general sense of where you're going, is that enough?
Yeah, I think a general sense of where you're going is enough, in terms of what you want to research. They're not asking for a fully formed research proposal, but it needs to be something hinting at the direction that you're going. Now, obviously, this will be easier if you're someone who is more academically focused, unlike me. You'll have a little bit better idea, and it's probably going to be easier, like if you're coming fresh out of education,
Mm.
because you'll be immersed in the kind of the style of that kind of writing. But
Definitely still
uh,
possible.
yeah, I was lucky to have a friend who had gotten the MEX scholarship a couple years before, and he let me see his application,
Okay.
which I was able to model my own off of. But there are lots of people that have posted their
Oh, great. Yeah.
stuff online, so you can just search for that if that's something that that anyone listening to this is interested in doing. There is a lot of information about applying out there.
Awesome. Well, man, we're coming up on the hour. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but this was really awesome. I think so much good information. I mean, it's been amazing following your career. I know that you're probably hard at work on some cool translations right now, but before I let you go, I've got 3 questions that I ask everyone. Do you have a favorite kind of onigiri?
Yes, it's really boring though. My favorite is tuna mayo.
Oh, classic. Yeah. What's your go-to Japanese karaoke song?
Again, really boring. I'm sorry. I think I'm a really boring person, but it's Linda, Linda, Linda by the Blue Hearts. That never fails to get people excited.
Yes, that's a really good one. I mean, that's totally underrated at this point, I feel like.
It's also like really easy to sing.
Yeah.
It's really easy to sing. Like, especially first thing in a night of karaoke when you haven't let down your guard that much. It's a great go-to.
I love being that person. You need that person who's got that song that's just like, okay, let's get it started. Let's go.
Exactly.
You know? And then what's something you remember from your very first week in Japan, I guess when you were 12?
I remember. What do I remember? I don't remember very much because I was half delirious with
Yeah.
pneumonia. But I remember seeing a Coca-Cola truck from the bus from Narita Airport and thinking it was so small. I just remember thinking, wow,
Yeah.
Japanese trucks are so small.
Yeah. That's great. It's funny what sticks with you, you know? It really is. Well, thanks so much for your time. Where can people find you online?
You can find me on Twitter at Wrongs Reversed, and you can go to my Half Dead blog, which is allwrongsreversed.net.
Great. Well, thanks so much, and good luck with all the translation work.
Thank you for having me. Otsukare-sama.
Otsukare-sama desu. Thanks for listening. You can find How to Japanese on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and Substack. And we'll see you next week. それではまた来週.